What is up, YouTube? Today we're talking about recipe creation on our precision equipment here at Tree House. Welcome back to the channel. It's been a little while since we've been here on the brew deck and we've talked brewing equipment, so we're excited to get back into this. If this is your first time here, we've made several videos about the brewery, starting with a behind the scenes brewhouse tour, a cellar tour, a packaging line tour, a warehouse tour. We've shown you guys all this equipment on a grand, broad scale. And in this video, I want to take you guys behind the scenes in terms of how this equipment works, how we modify it, exactly how precise it is, and how we make a recipe on this incredible semi-automated equipment. So I'm not going to waste much time in the intro. Let's dive right in and see what it looks like. So what you're seeing on screen right now is our GUI. It's our graphical user interface. So what you're seeing is a translation of all of the sensors and equipment that we have out on the floor so that we can manipulate all of the variables here on the brew house. For this video, I'm going to create a brand new recipe. And a recipe on this scale is not the way that you think about a recipe at home. It's not necessarily the things that go into making the beer. It's telling the brew house what you want it to do as a batch makes its way through the brew house. First and foremost, you have what's called your procedure. So over here on the left, if you click on procedures, you'll see that we have a CIP procedure and a beer procedure. And for today's video, we're going to work with the beer procedure because we're talking about making a beer recipe. In terms of how this works, you can also make a clean in place recipe, which tells the brew house, the automated equipment, how to go about cleaning our equipment. You have two classifications here on this particular brewing setup. And if you've watched previous videos, you'll know that all of this has been customized specifically for our brewing needs. I think you guys are going to be blown away with how many variables you can adjust and how many things you can tweak in the brewing process. On a more manual setup, you will have far less control than you have on a semi-automated setup like this. And the beauty of it is we can interact with this brew house and change variables at any step of the process with a great amount of precision, as you guys will soon see. Every recipe has a hierarchy, and the hierarchy starts with what's called the procedure. And the procedure is essentially a set of automated commands that run a batch through the brew house from start to finish. A recipe is modifying that procedure, that set procedure, and changing the variables as a batch makes its way through the brew house. Each brew house vessel has what's called a sequence. So our mill has a sequence, our malt silos have a sequence, our mash mixer has a sequence, lauter tun has a sequence, wort kettle, whirlpool, and then our wort chiller. All of those modules have a specific set of steps that take a batch of beer through the brew house. And a recipe lets you dial in all those details with a great deal of precision. So first thing I want to show you guys here is a procedure. So I'm going to click on brew line, and as I dive in here, you will be able to see all of the modules here that I just discussed. At the bottom, we have the malt hopper, the malt transport, the mill, mash tun, lauter tun, wort kettle, whirlpool, etc. And as I drill down into these specific modules, you'll see the types of control you can have in your procedure. First, I'll click on the mill star. And on the left here is your sequence. From top to bottom, you have a start step, a ready step, start crushing rollers, pre-steeping, milling, post-steeping, post-milling, rinsing with rollers. All of those things happen in sequence as your batch makes its way on through. That procedure is just for the mill star. And if you jump into the mash tun kettle, you'll see that there's other parameters that are valuable as well. You have your hot water rinse, which will preheat your mash tun. Of course, you have your mashing in step. You have your heating up step, which means you're either doing a step mash or you're using the heat to achieve your mash temperature. So if you come in low at 150 and your set point's 152, this mash mixer has a steam jacket that will bring you up to your purported mash temperature. Moving on from that, we have other heating up steps, which we may or may not use depending on the beer. You know, for example, in Hefeweizen, we'll do a many step mash with a ferulic acid rest. We'll step it up to another temperature and another temperature before mashing off. So the important thing that I want to impart upon you guys for this brew house specifically, and on a commercial scale, we have a high degree of flexibility in terms of how we mash and the temperatures that we achieve. I won't linger too long on this section. For this video, I'll keep it relatively simple, and if you guys want me to drill down more into the details of this in a future video, leave your thoughts and comments down below. So now, hopefully you guys understand the procedure versus a recipe. A procedure is a base set of things that happen as a beer runs through the brew house that can be overridden by parameters that you create within a brew house recipe. The important thing to remember is that as we're making a batch, we can adjust any of these variables on the fly. We can actuate any valve that we want. We actually have articulating valves. They're called modulating valves. So if we need to accelerate a flow rate or reduce a flow rate based on grain bed pressure, it's measured as millimeters water column. We can speed up or slow down the runoff either by adjusting a variable frequency drive pump or articulating a valve, or a combination of both. You know, if you're a home brewer or if you're a commercial brewer has manual equipment, you'll often do those things by adjusting a valve by hand and with your sight. On a brew house like this, we have sensors on everything, so we have precision data and feedback in terms of everything we're doing. And before I dive into the recipe aspect, I want to show you guys really quickly what I mean with some data that we log in real time in our lauter ton, which we're running a batch right now. We're actually running a batch of Cache through the brew house right now. And before we dive into a recipe, I'm gonna take a look at that really quickly. So here on our process screens, you can see our mill, our mash mixer, our lauter ton's currently in a deep cut, which means the pressure got too high, and risking a stuck mash, it will actually go down and cut the grain, recirculate to clarity before rerunning off again, which just concluded. And if we dive into the lauter ton screen, you'll see this little button right here. We have all kinds of data in terms of what's happening in your lauter ton. So if we get to the wort kettle, or if we have difficulty with our lauter and we're not sure why, we can open up this screen and we can see the trends and the details about a specific batch, temperatures, the wort clarity, the pressure, you name it. We have infinite troubleshooting capabilities with all of this data and feedback that this brew house collects. So the next thing that I want to do is make a recipe. You guys will see a number of recipes here on the screen right now. It's obviously not all of our beers, and the important thing to know about these recipes is that they're just ideas about how a beer runs through the brew house. So water volumes, temperatures, sparging volumes in a double IPA will generally be about the same depending on grain volume, different temperatures for mash, and salt adjustments and things like that. Those are all things that we adjust on the fly. The general principles surrounding the brew of an IPA or a double IPA or a Pilsner are relatively similar. So these instances cost us a ton of money to maintain on the server. So we try to limit the amount of actual recipes that we utilize on an ongoing basis, because honestly, we brew quite manually with each successive batch. Go to my recipe files, click on create. We're gonna call this production YouTube double IPA. Procedure, now remember, we're modifying this procedure with this recipe, so we have to make sure we select the correct procedure to modify. And in this case, we will be selecting the beer line, make sure that populates, and then the product is gonna be called YouTube Special. And then I'm gonna click on OK. And I'm gonna be greeted by this amazing screen that has all of the things that I have said to the procedure matter to making Treehouse beer. So procedures identified, it's populated this procedure with all the base aspects. And now for the recipe, we can go through and make modifications. This process would take me probably 25 or 30 minutes. And for the sake of the length of this video, I'm gonna run through this relatively quickly and just point out a few things that we can modify before saying that this recipe is good to go. So we're making the YouTube double IPA. We want it to be a little bit sweeter. We want to mash at, let's say, 156. Based on what we know about our strike temperature versus where the temperature of the grain settles, for a beer at 156, we'll mash in around 168 to 170. So now, as I start the crushing rollers, I'm gonna set them a little bit higher because I know that they're cold. 172 to get our crushing rollers lubricated and moving, make sure they're working well. The pre-steeping step is a step where the wet mill fills with grain and the grain is saturated with water. That's another step where I'll make the temperature a little bit higher. Depending on whether or not we're following another batch or if we're brewing the first batch of the day, you will always make tiny adjustments. But again, because we're trying to mash high, I will err on the side of caution and say 175 for the pre-steeping step. Now that we move into the milling step, I'm gonna say 170. Now again, it's important to remember that when this is happening in real time, I can actually jump over to his screen right now because John's mashing in a batch and show you that as this happens in real time, this inlet temperature over here is my strike temperature. So right now he's striking at 172 and the grain is going into the mash mixer at 156. And if I need to, I can actually click on this. I can click into the procedure, open this screen up, and change my water temperature coming in. Right now the set point's 172. It's going in at 156, which is what he wants, but I can change that to 168 and then hit OK. I'm not gonna do that to him because he's nailing his mash temperature right now, but I want you guys to understand exactly how precise this is because it's incredible. Let's head back into the recipe where we had been playing around there before. I can make any change that I want. Am I salt dosing? Yes or no? What's my total mash water requirement? What is my grain to water ratio going to be? That's a simple calculation based on what you're trying to achieve, whether it's 1.1 or 1.4 or 1.6. I could do that quick math and then populate my water volume prior to mashing in. But again, if things are going wrong or if things are moving too quickly, make those changes on the fly. Of course, I have my mash rest temperatures. I've got 4 options for mash rest, so I can have like a protein rest, a sac rest, a mash off, beta amylase rest. The options are unlimited here. I can set my time, I can set my temperature for each mash, how slowly the temperature ramps up. So if I'm going from 145 to 155, I can do that over 5 minutes, I can do it over 30 minutes. The mash rest step also has an enormous amount of flexibility. All right, so the next thing I want to show you guys is the lauter ton step. Brewhouse like this, the lauter ton is the most complex, advanced software precision that we have on the Brewhouse. Clarity, timing, temperature, volume of water, number of sparges, where you decide to deep cut if your grain bed pressure becomes too high. All of those things are highly, highly adjustable. And during commissioning of this brewhouse, that was actually one of the things that was the most difficult for us to dial in. On the screen here, you'll see the cloudy wort. And cloudy wort's a professional term for what you know as the Vorlauf. It's where you recirculate wort from the bottom of the grain back on top to clarify it. Here, our timing is usually lengthier than the standard. And what we've been advised, because we want to make sure we have perfectly clear wort before we run off, so we avoid any polyphenolic extraction in our wort before we run off. Of course, the next parameter that we have is time for first wort and time for second wort. So on a brew house like this, first wort is the stuff that you run off before you start adding water to the top. So you run that beautiful sweet wort off first, and that usually takes a while. And then once you start adding hot water to the top, we call that second wort. And that's where you can start to speed things up and the majority of your runoff takes place as you rinse that beautiful sweet sugar water from the grain and into the wort kettle. This next section here obviously needs to be adjusted, but basically you have calculation of how much wort you're going to extract in your first wort, which is you'll have a percentage of loss. So if you mash in with 1,000 gallons of water, our brew house and everyone's brew house has a certain percentage of absorption that takes place and how much you extract. So we try to add right about as much water to the top of the sparge to ensure that we have a dry grain bed at the end and we don't leave any of that sweet wort behind. And this particular thing, over a series of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 water spargings, lets us dial in the number that we want to ensure that we wind up exactly where we want to be. And this here has taken years and years of trial and error to find the best efficiency to get the best wort quality without leaving anything behind. Man, there's so many things here. This video could be like 5 hours long because there's so much here. Every variable is modifiable. You know, where we decide to deep cut or where we decide to stop deep cutting at the end of the runoff to take the chance on whether or not we get a stuck runoff or we waste a little bit of time waiting for that deep cut. You can have that be 85% of runoff, 95% of runoff. Again, we've learned our values over the years and we're pretty confident where they are now. Of course, malt transport amount is part of the recipe, but this is one that we'll modify on an ongoing basis. You know, for our YouTube special double IPA, we'll probably add 4,200 pounds of 2-row. And between like dextrin malts and specialty malts, to get a 8 to 8.5% double IPA, we're probably using 4,800 pounds of total grain or something thereabouts. For reasons related to quality, we're not always the most efficient brewery in the world because we aren't worried about efficiency, we're worried about wort quality. So when you crunch our efficiency numbers, you might be surprised. All right, before I move on to showing you guys some specific brewing process screens, hopefully you've gotten the idea here. Wort kettle boiling time, wort kettle boiling temperature, steam pressure to the boil, meaning like time it takes to heat the boil. All of these things are adjustable on this brew house with an extraordinary amount of capability. You can make those adjustments either in the procedure or in the recipe to have exactly what you want for the beer that you want. But it's really important to remember that all of these variables are controllable in real time. In fact, even more so than we have control over the recipe by looking at the process screens. So here we have a grand overview of our process screens, and I want to dive into one of these module screens to show you guys the next level of precision that we have. So we have the procedure, we have the recipe, and then we have real-time brewing. And here at Tree House, this brew house has been outfitted for that real-time brewing to be the most important thing. So the operator behind the screen can drill into any sequence at any time and make even more precise modifications based on conditions in the field, based on malt quality, hop quality, etc. So this is the process screen overview. You can see the entire process from start to finish. You have the mill, the mash mixer, the lauter, wort kettle, the whirlpool, and then of course the heat exchanger. So we will dive into the lauter tun and see what we got. This is probably a lot to take in, but down here at the bottom, you have the mash tun, the lauter star, and the wort kettle. And that is part of your sequence. And your sequence is controlled by your procedure. So as this brew is making its way through the brew house, it's happening automatically until it runs into a step that tells it to stop. And we have guardrails that we've installed to tell it to stop, but we also are at the wheel at all times. So it's like an automated car where we kind of grab the wheel and pull it out of autopilot when we need to take control. So this runoff is happening in real time right now. It's a batch of cachet moving through the brew house. Wort is going into the wort kettle at 27 gallons per minute. We've had 4 deep cuts, which isn't particularly ideal, and things here are going pretty well. So one example of something that I might do to make an adjustment to this batch if we were running into trouble is I might say, okay, the actual pressure difference within the lauter is gaining pressure too quickly. The best way to combat that is to slow the runoff speed down. So I want you guys to pay close attention to what happens. The set point is 26 gallons per minute. It's running at 25.3 and this modulating valve is adjusting. So if I go into the sequence, if I drill down here and I open this up and I find the step timer, I can actually make a change in real time that will affect that runoff rate. So the time of second wort is currently set at 1 hour and 15 minutes. If I slow this down, let's take 1 hour and 45 minutes. For this step, what's going to happen is the brew house is automatically going to adjust our runoff rate, reduce our pressure, and give us a more stable runoff. Once the brew house makes that calculation, now the set point's 19.3 gallons per minute, and it's going to magically adjust. So you can see that modulating valve, it's closing. It's closing. Now it's at 68%, 67%, 66%, 65%. And the value on the bottom is your actual flow rate and your value on the top is the set point. So by making that manual change on the fly, I am adjusting what's happening in real time. And this is just one example of a manual operator override that we use on every batch, every day, every minute as beers run through this brew house. So you might think that being at a big scale like Tree House or having this big semi-automated brew house somehow takes away the precision of brewing. But the reality is it actually makes it substantially easier to adjust the variables with a high degree of precision that are really important to brewing. If you were doing this with a valve, it would be a visual thing. You'd say, oh, it looks like it's running a little bit slower now, but I have objective data that tells me that by making a key variable change, I have slowed down the flow rate. Now I'm gonna go back in here. I just did that as an example. I'm gonna increase that number back up again, and we're gonna watch that pump and that modulating valve open up to let that wort travel through a little bit faster. One thing you have to be really careful for is that sometimes when you make changes, the brewhouse will overcompensate because a modulating valve is very difficult to write an algorithm for. So anytime you do make adjustments, you want to make small ones, wait and see what happens, and then make another small adjustment. I went up to 1 hour and 45 minutes for that step. I'm going to go back to 1 hour and a half and split the difference. Again, because I don't want to do anything too drastic. This is the 7th year we've had this brewhouse. Literally the longest brewhouse by far that Tree House has had our hands on. We're approaching our 7,000th batch, and being able to make this level of adjustment is still like the coolest thing to me. So again, the flow rate was set to 18 gallons per minute automatically based on the brewhouse's calculation of how long it would take for that volume of wort to reach the wort kettle. So once I make this change, I can go back in and I can see that the set point has now climbed 3 gallons per minute. The modulating valve is going to start to open. It was at 68, now it's at 72, and it's slowly and carefully adjusting that flow rate by modulating this valve, only allowing a certain amount of wort through. So my set point is 20.8. Right now it's running at 18 gallons per minute, and as that modulating valve opens, that speed is going to increase. Overwhelmingly complex video, overwhelmingly complex subject. Admittedly, I got in a bit over my head thinking that this would be a straightforward video, and now I'm realizing you and I could talk about this for hours, but hopefully you got the sense of how our brewhouse works and how we've outfitted it to be as precise as humanly possible to let us adjust all the variables that are necessary. The last thing that I want you to remember is that this brewhouse works like this. Procedure hierarchy, that's a beer running through the brewhouse on a set procedure. The recipe is a thing that modifies all of the variables of the procedure. The sequence is what happens when you hit go on a brew. And then for everything on this brewhouse, we have a manual override. So all of your temperatures, flow rates, modulating valves, you name it, we can adjust it in real time on the fly to suit our needs and ensure that every wort that comes out of this brewhouse is absolutely impeccable. Guys, we love your comments. We love the community here. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe. It's a huge help to us. We'll answer your questions in the comments. I want to thank you guys for watching and happy brewing.